We are going to be starting off here by talking about that win last night that we saw the New York Knicks taking game 2 against the Indiana Pacers. Things looked a little bit bleak there at one point where Jalen Brunson left the game with an injury in the first quarter. Circumstances surrounding it were pretty strange. It didn't really look like it was a foot injury, which is what it is being reported as. There was a little bit of confusion there, but he missed the entire second quarter, and then when he came back in the second half, as usual, he was lights out. Now, the Knicks were also dealing with an OG Anunoby injury that took him out in the third quarter through the rest of the game, so we'll be touching on that as well. But I want to start with you, Jeremy. What was your takeaway for the fact that the Knicks were able to fight through these injuries and yet still come away with the win?
Yeah, so you touched on it. Injuries are a major part of the Knicks' season so far. You know, not just this game. They lost Julius Randle near the end of the season, and he's out for the entire playoffs. They've been battling through this, and for the most part, it hasn't affected them because of how Jalen Brunson has been playing. But the fact that they're able to still have this next man up mentality, even with losing all three of their star players at some point in this series or in the previous point in the seasons, they've been able to battle back. They've been dominating the playoffs so far, and Jalen Brunson has been a huge part of that. So having him back out there is going to be big. I'm curious to see how much the lack of OG Anunoby and his defense is going to affect them in the future. But the fact that they've been able to battle through all these injuries has been one of the most impressive parts of this run to me.
Yeah, Anunoby's loss is interesting because obviously Brunson is the headliner, and it seems like for the most part the Knicks will go as far as he can take them offensively, even though you do have to give credit to some of these other role players who, you know, with so much attention on Brunson, he is getting doubled at the end of these games, and we're seeing the likes of Josh Hart, Dante DiVincenzo specifically, come up and hit these big-time shots, but OG's defense also cannot be overlooked in this instance as well. Garrison, do you have any thoughts on sort of the injury bug that is surrounding the Knicks right now?
Yeah, I mean, this is kind of what happens when you play guys 48 minutes a night, as you kind of saw the Knicks kind of doing throughout the regular season. The injuries were always going to catch up to them, and that might affect them going forward in this series. But as long as they keep shooting efficiently, that's kind of what the story of last night was. 57 from the field, 46 from three, 80 from the free throw line. I mean, when they're making their shots, Dante DiVincenzo, Josh Hart, OG Anunoby, when he was in the game, he was lights out. All of these guys very efficient shooting last night, and that's kind of what got them through that game.
Yeah, you mentioned the heavy minutes that Thibodeau has been playing these guys. I mean, it is something, it's a reputation that has surrounded him for whatever
Yeah.
those player polls are worth. There's always those anonymous polls that the Players Association puts out, and Tom Thibodeau is consistently named the number one coach that players would not want to play for, and it's because of these heavy minutes where we've now seen Josh Hart play all 48 minutes of 4 of the Knicks games so far in this postseason. That is the most amount of times in an entire playoff run. We're just in game 2 of the second round, the most since Jimmy Butler in 2013. Who was the head coach for the Chicago Bulls in 2013? It was Tom Thibodeau. So, Sam, I want to ask you about what do you think the ability for the Knicks to continue playing these players heavy minutes? We know they have a very limited bench unit, and Thibodeau has chosen to sort of stray away from them. Do you think that fatigue could be a factor for the Knicks moving forward?
I definitely think so. I mean, you look at how much the Knicks players have played already. I mean, you said it, Josh Hart has just been overworking himself at this point. I understand that that's kind of his reputation. That's kind of what he's known for, being that kind of gritty little tough player. But playing 48 minutes for 2 or 3 games straight is going to catch up with you at some point. I think we saw it with Brunson yesterday going down with an injury. I think if Brunson does go down with something that is more serious, where he has to even miss a game or two, I think that might be kind of a wake-up call to Tom Thibodeau and the Knicks, just seeing that, oh, our star player is hurt now. So I think it's going to take one of those things for them to stop. But I do think eventually going to be a factor. I mean, if you have to play Boston, who is better than you, I'd say, and has a lot more depth than you. I think it's going to catch up at some point. You're going to go into a really tough fight. And let's say you even make it past Boston. You'd have to play a team like maybe Denver, Minnesota, one of the other great teams in the West, Dallas with Luka. So I think at some point fatigue is going to catch up with them, but it's just a matter of time. And I mean, again, this is the reputation Tom Thibodeau has. I think it's going to take something serious for him to kind of open up his eyes and see, but I definitely think it's going to be a factor soon.
Yeah, I feel like for the Knicks, I mean, in general, I don't know if this was the year when they made the trade for OG Anunoby at the deadline, and also the fact we haven't even mentioned the name Bojan Bogdanovic, who was also one of their big midseason acquisitions, and he has also been ruled out for the remainder of the playoffs. It's unfortunate the way that these injuries have unraveled. I feel like this was sort of a year, a stepping year. Now, I know they won a playoff series last year, but I thought that making the move for Anunoby, offloading some of their younger talent, but to become more win-ready, I thought that it was going to take a little bit more time to fully develop, but Jalen Brunson has just elevated them to this next level that we're at least having the conversations about them being a contender. To your point about the fatigue, Sam, and how much they are playing, it is sort of interesting to look at the fact where, you know, these guys are going to be worn out not just for this year, but we've seen specifically, if you look back at that Warriors dynasty, there were absolutely instances where coming out of that, we saw Steph Curry and some of those other Warriors sort of be staggered a little bit in the coming regular seasons. Now, definitely, I'm sure if you're a Knicks fan, you're just trying to enjoy the moment right now and make the most of the current situation. But when you have a guy like Josh Hart who is working himself to the brim every single game, curious what that's going to look like long term here. So is there anybody here who thinks that the Knicks are the biggest threat to the Boston Celtics? Because they are, at least in the Eastern Conference, the measuring stick.
I will go ahead, Jeremy, actually.
Yeah, no, because you talk about the Knicks this season, and really I think a lot of their success in the playoffs so far, aside from Jalen Brunson, has to do with external factors. It's been an extremely weak Eastern Conference outside of the Celtics all season. And I think to say anybody else in the East provides much of a threat to the Celtics is just flat out wrong. The Pacers, they don't have the defense to do it. If you look at the numbers, all the teams that are winning now have a top 10 defensive efficiency rating in the NBA. You know, the Knicks are 9th. They're at the bottom of that list. But the way that they play with the energy, the way that Tom Thibodeau coaches them up, that adds a few extra rankings up there for me. But I don't think they're too big of a threat. We've talked a lot about their injuries, and Thibodeau's squads in the playoffs, especially the younger ones, they tend to do good out of the gates because they're playing with so much energy and so much enthusiasm, but eventually it just catches up to you. And there's a reason he has a losing record in the playoffs over his career.
For me, I don't think that the Cavs are that far off from competing with the Boston Celtics in their series. They were 11 of 42 in that game one. I think that they have a opportunity. You're also in Boston for the first two games, of course. So I think that they have an opportunity to kind of turn the series around when it comes to Cleveland. You saw them win all 4 games in Cleveland against the Magic. I think that they played different on home court, and that kind of transferred when they went to Orlando. They had opportunities in Game 6 after they got that reset kind of in Game 5. Really were close to winning that game. I think that they're able to make it a little bit more of a contending series, and I think that they match up pretty well against the Boston Celtics, especially down low in the paint.
Yeah, I think that offensively, you're right. They did leave a lot of opportunities on the table. I talked about this on my show the other day where the Celtics were very willing on everybody but Donovan Mitchell to give the opposing team's supplementary players a little bit space, heavy drop coverages, trying to take as much as they could away from Donovan Mitchell, and the reality is just nobody else stepped up. Darius Garland had another tough game. We have all seen what he can do, former All-Star. I believe that he should be better in this series moving forward, but it is also, I feel like for me, the biggest issue is I don't know if the Cavaliers are going to be able to play the level of defense necessary to beat the Celtics 4 times in a series. And you're absolutely right. When they come back to Cleveland, they were a great home team during the regular season. During the Magic series, we saw how much that home court advantage mattered. And to your point as well with size, if we see Jarrett Allen back, I do feel like they can use that size mismatch a little bit, especially when the Celtics, I thought that he had a solid game, but bench big Luke Cornett, I know that, as a Celtics fan, I'm probably a little bit more familiar with him than the majority of the national audience is, but Cornett isn't necessarily somebody that you feel super confident in rolling out there for 15, 20 minutes a game. We could see that Porzingis injury end up catching up with them, as we have a comment from our good friend here at the GSMC Sports Network, Kenneth Grunfelder, talking about the possibility of Boston and New York battling out in the NBA Conference Finals as well as the NHL. We are going to be getting into the hockey part of this in the next segment, but just sort of, I guess, as a little bit of a teaser here, out of the 4 teams, for those of you who aren't familiar with the current NHL playoff picture, we also have the Boston Bruins and Florida Panthers, who are both alive in the NHL playoffs as well. So, Garrison, I'll go to you here. Out of those 4 teams, the Knicks, Celtics, Rangers, and Bruins, which one of them do you think is the most likely to break up this super conference finals between Boston and New York?
Yeah, I think it's the Bruins, clearly. They just dropped the game last night 6-1 to the Panthers. That's a very deflating game. Of course, they take one on the road, so they have home ice advantage for the rest of this series. But I still do not believe in this team to kind of get past the Florida Panthers, who seemed throughout the regular season, and especially in this game too here, seemed like a step ahead of Boston. It just didn't look good for Boston in game 2 at all. They got that first goal, and we'll talk about this a little bit more in the second segment, but Panthers just kind of dominated them.
I feel like for me, I do, and we're going to get into the NHL side of this very shortly, but before we move off of the NBA conversation as things currently stand, I don't know about you guys, I'm not fully, especially dealing with these injuries, I do think that the Pacers have a better shot than a lot of people are giving them credit for. That bench unit and the difference between the Knicks and the Pacers in this situation, I do think is something that can be exploited. We see the full court presses that the Pacers have been running against the Knicks to put the pressure on them, and I feel like, again, as we're talking about Thibodeau and the amount of minutes he's putting on his players in this situation, I feel like we could see it end up catching up with some of their key players, and if Brunson isn't at 100%, I don't know if they have those other names they can rely on more. I feel like Deuce McBride is having a pretty solid playoffs. Doesn't seem like Thibodeau is all the way there on him just yet, but we shall see. Does anybody have any other thoughts here on the Pacers' chances against the Knicks in this series? If not, then that is all we have for this segment. We are going to be taking our first break here, and when we come back on the other side, we are going to be diving into the NHL picture of that question that Kenneth just asked us in the comment section. So stick with us, and we will be right back.